The Washington Naval Treaty marked a turning point in the Anglo-American relationship. Though Balfour actually gained most of what Whitehall had wanted at the negotiations, the United States established itself, both symbolically and practically, as Britain's equal, and Washington's intention to use this newfound power became immediately clear. During the treaty negotiations, America had lobbied for an end to the Anglo-Japanese alliance in the Pacific. For 20 years this had provided overstretched British naval resources immense relief in the Far East. Now the possibility arose of negotiations stalling, and a naval race with the US that Britain could ill afford if the alliance was not jettisoned. The cabinet was divided. Curzon and the imperialist wing viewed Washington as unreliable and unlikely to offer much in the way of compensation. Pro-American figures like Churchill, however, believed satiating the US was worth the potential trouble of an unbound Japan, a completely correct assessment with absolutely no problems 20 years down the line. When a British statesman voiced reservations about dropping the alliance to the incoming Secretary of State, Hughes, his response was a masterclass in diplomatic subtlety. "You would not be here to speak for Britain," Hughes ranted. "You would not be here speaking anywhere. England would not be able to speak at all. It is the Kaiser who would be heard if America, seeking nothing for herself but to save England, had not plunged into the war and won it. And you speak of obligations to Japan?" British politicians grumbled, but it was decided avoiding the ire of Hughes, let alone that of the whole United States, was preferable to Japanese friendship. On the whole, however, Washington did not as yet seek to challenge the British Empire. Isolation is really a misnomer for American policy in the interwar era, but it is true London was left in relative peace to police its imperium without interference. On the other hand, the refusal to join the League of Nations did not mean the United States gave up its influential presence in world affairs. The main issue in Anglo-American, indeed European-American relations in the 1920s was the problem of reparation and debt repayments. European nations were burdened with exorbitant post-war bills, most of them owed to the United States. The Republican administrations of the 1920s were generally sympathetic to the predicament of the US's wartime co-belligerents, but their hands were to an extent tied. Outright debt cancellation, like the French agitated for, would shift the burden onto American taxpayers and spark domestic revolt. Even so, settlements could be generous. Mussolini's Italy was given an agreement which forgave 75% of its debt to the US, and before the French refused it as an insult, a similar offer was made to Paris. But these solutions had the impact of seriously annoying British statesmen, who had been given nothing like so generous terms, and were still devoting most of their country's income to repayments. British attrition in the war, particularly in the financial arena, was far less obvious than the systematic destruction of northern France by the Germans. Thus it was harder to elicit sympathy from Washington. And besides, few American politicians seriously wanted Britain to so easily wriggle off the hook and reassert any form of economic dominance. Even more annoying for Britain and France was the regular US badgering about lowering German reparations. The British and French agreed, but on condition that the US wrote down their war debts that the German indemnity was supposed to pay. Again, Washington refused to link the two. This petty selfishness on both sides of the Atlantic did more than anything else to create rifts in the interwar period. The relationship was not helped by the fundamental uncertainties of the post-war world order. Prior to 1914, the global financial system had centred on the City of London, but the consequences of the war for Britain, ranging from the liquidation of its overseas assets to its abandonment of the gold standard and its exorbitant debt, meant in whose image global trade was to be reconstructed was uncertain. Both sides of the Atlantic naturally wanted the system to play to their inherent advantages. The US, with enormous gold reserves, trade surpluses and political debt receipts, wanted a market-regulated gold standard to truly maximise American economic advantages. In contrast, Britain, with relatively meagre gold reserves, a problem trade and high debt, wanted an internationally regulated gold exchange standard, with separate currency areas for the dollar and pound. These two systems effectively coexisted unhappily for the first part of the 1920s, before the Dominions, South Africa in particular, accepted American suggestions to return to gold without Britain if necessary. This meant London faced the prospect of restricted trade within its own empire, and thus the Chancellor, Churchill, took the decision to revert to the gold standard in 1925. But with free trade in a pound overvalued by about 10%, British exports suffered dreadfully in the consequent period of deflation. Financial competition thus remained a sticking point throughout the interwar period. The US continued its policy of high tariff walls, allowing her industries to build up economies of scale. Britain, contrastingly, voted against any implementation of tariffs, and so continued the economic self-flagellation that had been the cornerstone of the country's policy since the 1840s. Armaments was another issue that plagued Anglo-American relations. Coolidge called the first of several ill-fated disarmament conferences in 1927 between Britain, the US and Japan. It quickly became a farce and descended into petty squabbling over cruiser strength. For the British, it in their mind showed how dangerous placing any reliance on the US would be. American policy was solely about getting a good election cry for Coolidge by saying they had not only made a further peace move, but also twisted the British lion's tail by making him reduce his cruiser strength, muttered Bridgman, who also thought US delegates were not only very conceited, but often very stupid. Unsurprisingly then, the Americans were of the opinion Britain seemed to have lost none of its old imperial arrogance. It would, however, be wrong to over-exaggerate disagreements in this period. Although both nations famously had war plans drawn up in case of a conflict with one another, never did tensions rise to the level of the mid-19th century, and by the late 1920s, issues surrounding reparations and debt repayments seemed to have finally disappeared from the diplomatic conversation, as American loans to Germany allowed Berlin to pay the reparations with which Britain and France could repay Washington. But suspicions remained on both sides. Hankey's exasperated protests sum up the British view succinctly. Time and time again we have been told that if we made this concession or that concession, we should secure goodwill in America. We have given up the Anglo-Japanese alliance, we agreed to pay our debts, and we have again and again made concessions on this ground. I believe we are less popular and more abused in America than ever before because they think us weak. US statesmen, on the other hand, were befuddled by the British belief that they were owed something for a war many Americans increasingly saw as a mistake, summed up in Coolidge's exasperated cry of, "They hired the money, didn't they?" In 1929, Wall Street plunged and the world economy sank into depression. Hoover reacted with the rightly condemned Smoot-Hawley tariff, excessive even by American standards. With Europe reeling, in 1931 he announced a one-year moratorium on debt repayment, mainly in a bid to save American loans to Germany. But in long-suffering France, the depression and cancellation of German reparations in 1932, on the false impression their debts would follow, proved to be the final straw, and Paris announced a suspension of debt repayments to Britain and America until international circumstances were more favourable. This caused a serious crisis in London. The US still refused to contemplate even a debt write-down, let alone forgiveness, and Hoover forced Britain to renew their payments in full in 1932. Hopes that the incoming President, Roosevelt, would be more flexible were immediately dashed. He demanded at least what he called token repayments, until even this small mercy was crushed by Congress's passing of the Johnson Act, which prohibited loans to foreign governments behind on instalments. Britain now faced an upcoming payment of $262 million in June 1934, without either French or Russian support, whilst even German reparations had dried up. This, coupled with the ascendancy of Hitler in Berlin, raising the spectre of costly rearmament, finally proved too much. Britain announced it would suspend further payments. The limbo this debt was left in remains its status today. Washington has not forgiven it, but neither does it actively seek repayment, as doing so would probably ruin the increasingly impoverished modern British economy. H.G. Nicholas perhaps best summed up this whole sordid business. It is impossible to follow the course of the so-called war debt controversy without a feeling of disgust and irritation at the stupidity, insensitivity and small-mindedness by almost all participants. In the aftermath of this sorry episode, however, there was a very rare outbreak of economic competence in London under the careful stewardship of Neville Chamberlain. Having been forced from the gold standard in 1931, Britain finally implemented a very moderate form of imperial preference the next year, at long last offering British manufacturers some protection from American industries. Combined with the policy of a balanced budget, Britain's recovery from the Depression was quicker than Washington's. However, the abandonment of wartime debt, the implementation of tariffs, and the competitive devaluations London undertook throughout the decade all combined to infuriate America. It meant as the dictators gained strength throughout the 1930s, the rift between Britain and the United States, who together could have contained any threat, was too wide for joint action. Neither power was moved to act over the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Back in Europe, as Germany once again emerged as a threat to European peace, there was little hope in London that the United States would be of much help. It was always best and safest to count on nothing from the Americans except words, Chamberlain said. For the majority of British statesmen, their estimation of the United States was barely describable, and part of the reason for Chamberlain's caution in the lead-up to the war was his acceptance that Britain would not be able to draw on the US this time. As a conflict became more likely, Congress passed the Johnson and Neutrality Acts. These restricted the sale of war material to belligerents and blocked the ability of those states that had defaulted on their great war debts to borrow. If Britain and France then ended up in a long war with Germany, which they could well do if they went into the conflict unprepared, their ability to finance the campaign would be severely restricted. As the true barbarism of the German regime became apparent with events such as Kristallnacht and the occupation of Prague, US opinion began to shift. Though the public remained staunchly isolationist, Roosevelt in particular began searching for ways to assist the Allies. Upon entering the Second World War, Chamberlain in no way imagined the United States would be involved. It was hoped and expected Britain would be able to buy from the New World and overcome Germany in part by drawing on the US's immense resources, but the war was always expected to be confined to Europe. Yet Roosevelt was not sitting idly by. Even as German panzers prepared to tear through France, he announced his intention to build 60,000 aircraft. If the US shared the seas with the Royal Navy, the president was making it clear the US Air Force was to dominate the skies, whatever the outcome of the war. Roosevelt and most Americans, indeed most commentators, expected an eventual Anglo-French victory. Instead, it took 6 weeks for the Germans to slice through Allied lines and capture Paris. Britain, whose plan had rested upon using the large French army to blunt any German attack, faced its most catastrophic strategic position since the treaties of Tilsit. Chamberlain, always sceptical of American intentions, had been replaced by Churchill in May. Though privately deeply pessimistic about the British position, in cabinet he fought off suggestions of a compromise peace from the likes of Halifax. Key to the half-American Churchill's defence was the argument that intervention from the United States was genuinely close, that if Britain only held out, America surely must come to the aid of her groaning brother. Whether this was naivety, delusion, or absurd optimism, it was nonetheless a useful argument that helped Churchill overcome, if not convince, his doubters in the moment of crisis. The British Empire would continue the war, but it was apparent that aid was seriously needed. Yet for the time being, that aid was scarce. The Neutrality Acts tied Roosevelt's hands a great deal. Fewer than 3% of the American public supported entering the war, and the president's main concern in this period was that the Royal Navy should not fall into German hands if Britain was defeated. The ambassador, Kennedy, was scathing about Britain's chances in the war, and has since been reviled as a defeatist, but as John Charmley says, his real crime was to have reported unsentimentally on one of the most sentimentalised moments in recent British history. Churchill continued to cling to the hope that American entry was on the horizon. He positively leapt on Roosevelt's Charlottesville speech of June the 10th, where the president spoke of extending aid full speed ahead to the Allies. But Roosevelt was aghast at Churchill's trust in American intervention. Whatever the president's aims, something not easy to decipher, his hands were tied by a Republican-dominated Congress and an election in November. Of course, neither Roosevelt or the American public were totally indifferent to Britain's plight. Even in 1939, the president had begun to chip away at the Neutrality Acts. In November, he persuaded Congress to agree to an amendment that would allow belligerents to buy from the United States so long as they paid in full and provided transportation, a system known as cash and carry. Since the Germans lacked the foreign exchange and access to the Atlantic, the amendment favoured Britain. Once France fell, Roosevelt was informed Britain had only the gold and dollar reserves to finance purchases on a cash and carry basis for a few months. He knew to continue supporting Britain he would have to stretch his legal authority. Using questionable pretexts, the administration raided depleted US arsenals for 500,000 rifles, 80,000 machine guns, 130 million rounds of ammunition, 975mm guns, and 1 million shells before shipping them to Britain. It wasn't enough, and by the end of 1940, British coffers were virtually empty. As the ambassador to Washington, Lord Lothian, simply put it to American reporters, "Britain's broke, it's your money we want." But Congress wasn't so easily persuaded. Suspicious that the British were hiding their true financial position, a Treasury official had to set out a complete list of London's holdings, securities, gold, and direct investments. Roosevelt announced his intention to provide further aid to Britain, with the analogy of lending a neighbour one's garden hose to put out a fire. The analogy struck a chord with the American public, and gave the president a fighting chance in passing what became known as the Lend-Lease Act. But Congress still demanded its pound of flesh. The US Treasury Secretary had to explain and testify before the House Foreign Affairs Committee the depths of British penury. It was utter and complete humiliation for a once mighty empire, driven home when the Lend-Lease Act was symbolically introduced as HR 1776, just in case the empire hadn't quite yet realised the new dynamic in the relationship. The act became law on the 11th of March 1941, and Churchill was later to describe it as the most unsordid act in the whole of recorded history. But the Prime Minister misunderstood the purpose of the act and how costly it would turn out to be. As Ben Style says, Lend-Lease was not intended as an act of generosity. Roosevelt contrived it as a stopgap means of keeping Germany and Japan at bay. That it happened also to be essential to Britain's survival was largely incidental. Indeed, the bill by no means came without strings. For the rest of the war, US officials would use Lend-Lease to relentlessly demand financial and trade concessions that would eliminate Britain as a rival completely in the post-war world. And in spite of all this, American intervention still seemed unlikely. As 1941 continued, Churchill's promises of US aid from a year earlier seemed to ring more hollow by the day. Although tensions between Washington and Berlin rose steadily, to the extent there was in effect an undeclared war between the Kriegsmarine and US Navy in the Atlantic, Roosevelt still stood little chance of changing public opinion, and the hostility towards the British Empire became, if anything, more prevalent among some US statesmen, Roosevelt among them. At a meeting between Churchill and the President in August, Britain and America agreed on the Atlantic Charter, Article 3 of which committed both to supporting the self-determination of all peoples. Though Churchill hurriedly announced this in no way applied to the British Empire, the symbolic impact of the document was unmistakable. In 1940, Britain ceased to be a serious competitor to the United States. The only question now was who would dominate the whole Britain was about to leave, Washington or Berlin. In this sense, Churchill still ironically held the balance of the future world order in his hands that year. Only the choice was not how to preserve London's place in it, but who would inherit, to paraphrase A.J.P. Taylor, the British succession, America or Germany. Churchill and the cabinet, though not realising it at the time, chose to fall back on the United States. No one really foresaw the price that would be extracted. Indeed, no one could possibly be sure the gamble would even result in US intervention, but the choice was made nonetheless. As it was, the decision to count on American intervention in the war was in the end correct, though not for the reasons of kinship or brotherly love as expected. It was aggression from another part of the world entirely that was to finally cement the uneasy alliance.